Hello and welcome to lesson number 2. We will continue today with our cycle of lectures on art history with a focus on the topic of the still life. And today we will continue discussing the topics that were already addressed on the last lesson. So in the last lesson, just to make a retrospective, we started addressing the topic of the still life in general, how the genre of the still life came to be, the definition, and so on, and then we advanced to see how through the different art periods. So we went through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. We also spoke a little bit. We went through the Baroque and so, and we saw how the still life as a genre was evolving and adapting through all these periods, and then we arrived at the 20th century, and also I talked a little bit about the avant-garde, different movements and how the different movements appropriated the topic of the still life, and how it evolved from different modes of expression which were addressed with the still life, and also how the topic of the still life was incorporated within the different art movements. And we went all the way through to Surrealism, and I also mentioned a little bit some artists that later picked up some ideas which were developed with the avant-garde, but only a little bit, just to give you an idea. So I mentioned, for example, Andy Warhol and other artists that also were very focused on working with the still life to develop their ideas. So what we are going to do today, we will be still on the avant-garde. So I will discuss each one of these movements in a little bit more detail. So today we won't be discussing so deeply the still life as a genre in itself, because we did it already before. So I will talk a little bit about each one of these avant-garde art movements. So beginning of the 20th century, we talked a lot about Cubism, so we won't talk so much about Cubism today, but I will go through each one of these movements, and we will end again with Surrealism. And the reason to do this is because, of course, it's important to talk about the still life, but this is a course on art history, and it's also important for you to have a notion of how each artistic movement of the avant-garde, how it developed, and which genres also were addressed. And of course, as you get in the complementary material, you will get examples of how each one of these movements integrated the still life and expressed these ideas also through the still life. And of course, this has a reason. It has to do with your Aufgabe. So most of the images I give you are supposed to give you references in this way, and that's why the theme of the images you get is still very focused on the still life. So you get the complementary material. It's already on Moodle, and so while you watch this lecture, I would actually suggest you to open the PDF with the lesson so that you can follow. As I discuss, you can follow the images, and then you don't have to watch the video first and then look at the images. Or you can also do that, but you can choose the way that works best for you. So giving a little bit an overview of the time span we will be talking about today. So we started with Cubism, so the very beginning of the 20th century, and now we will go through different movements. So we will go from about 1910 until 1930. And the movements we will cover today are Futurism, Suprematism, Dada, the Stil, Constructivism, Bauhaus, and Surrealism. So these are the movements we will be talking about today. And I will also start now this lecture before going straight to the movements, because before in the lecture before we talked about Cubism and how the Cubism was such a revolutionary approach to art and also to painting because of the invention of new artistic techniques. And I mentioned the collage, which in French was called the papier collé, which was invented by Pablo Picasso. And so when this was done with Cubism, with this starting to integrate objects from daily life in the painting or in the surface of the painting, this really changed the idea of what painting can be. And also, as I mentioned before, it flipped the boundary between what can be considered part of an artwork or not. Can we incorporate real properties of the real world into the painting? And by changing the contexts, and when the artist says this is part of the art, it questions what art can be, and it also opens up the possibilities of what art can be. So this was probably one of the first biggest innovations. And of course, Picasso was very involved. He was very experimental, and he was very involved in introducing these other components and these other approaches. So I just make now a list, and of course all these inventions were not all done by Picasso. We also talked in the last lesson about Marcel Duchamp, who brought also another really important invention, which was the ready-made. But making a list of, besides these two, one can say that the biggest new introductions in terms of working with different media that were brought by the Avantgarde were the collage, the ready-made, the found objects, or in French, objet trouvé, assemblage, appropriation, and also performance. So this was the time, the beginning of the 20th century, when performance art started to manifest as a kind of art form. And when we mention here performance, we are not talking about theater, but I will come to this next. So to make, now I made this list for you about these different techniques, and now I will develop a little more to give you an idea of, in terms of definitions of what each one of these techniques are. So a collage is basically the technique and the resulting work of art in which pieces of paper, photographs, fabric, and other ephemeral materials can be arranged and together in some supporting surface. As I mentioned before, the term collage comes from the French papier collé and describes this technique of pasting paper cutouts in different surfaces. Collage can include other media, for example, painting and drawing, and can also have three-dimensional elements. So you remember from Picasso, this example, one of the examples you have now, a still life from 1914, and it is a still life. And I mentioned in the class before, which has these elements glued together to make a still life with a glass and a piece of cheese and some other elements assembled on a fragment of a table. And there's even these little beads from what could be the tablecloth. So this is one example of what could be a collage. So one definition about collage, and this is by John Stitzeker, says collage allows opening up of conscious, which is very direct, and it's also a way of looking at what you are consuming all the time. So way before Andy Warhol in the 60s, we will get there, but just to give you an idea of continuity, there was already in the beginning of the 20th century, it started this awareness of consumption that we are constantly consuming things from the environment. And in the beginning of the 20th century, what were these things? They were connected to city life. So they were the newspapers, the tablecloth or the napkin that you use to clean the mouth, and or a magazine, or a train ticket, or a film ticket, or a theater ticket, and all these little remains of the day, or all these traces of daily life. Artists understood, or a stamp. It could also be a stamp from mail. So all these traces, artists at this time all developed the sensitivity to understand that these pieces of daily life are fragments of history, that they are also stories within themselves, and most of the times they also have artistic value because they were invented and designed by someone who also put a lot of thought into creating this little fragment. So in the context of the still life, as a genre, this also really opened up the possibilities, because instead of being limited to having, you know, the objects of daily life, the pair of glasses, or the pen, or metaphysical hourglass, or this kind of objects that of course have meanings, it was possible to start incorporating these things, which are also fragments from daily life, but which tell different kinds of stories and which are time and place specific. So from the moment, for example, that I do a collage and I integrate a train ticket there, and there's the date and the place and the name of the company and so on, the person who looks at this collage already has the possibility of being transported into this universe of all the things that happened that were involved in the creation of that artwork. So all these things reinforce the narrative. And why do I emphasize the narrative? Because of course this is important for you, for your Aufgabe, and this idea of storytelling through the medium. So just to give you now an overview of what collage can do. And of course, I decided to make this list with, and today also to make the lecture with a little bit more extensive focus on each one of these mediums, because my goal with this course for you is that you learn art history, but not just art history, learning the facts. Of course, the facts are important because that's also one of the goals and the requirements of the course. But for you to have an overview of how these techniques and how these ideas were used in different contexts and in different art movements, but how can you learn from them and appropriate it in your own creative strategies. So you can use these techniques, that's the whole point, and also integrate them with the Aufgabe, and later when you're working as architects, interior designers, stage designers, artists, you can use these techniques also for your daily life whenever you have any kind of creative challenge. So the whole idea is that by getting an overview of these techniques, you can also develop in your brain, understand them and develop in your brain these strategies to use them in your own creative processes. So just to give you a little bit more an idea of why we are talking today so extensively about these things. So now we move from the collage to another technique, and this is the ready-made. So the ready-made, as I mentioned before, the term ready-made was first introduced by the French artist Marcel Duchamp, and it describes works of art that he made from already manufactured objects. So objects which were already completely finished. It has been applied since then more generally to artworks by other artists made in this way. So, of course, the term ready-made started with Marcel Duchamp, but ready-made also became a way to describe the way a work of art can be done. So if an artist now produces a piece which has integrated components from objects which were already done. To describe the work, one can say this piece was created by using the process of ready-made, or this is a ready-made. So Duchamp's earliest ready-mades, including the bicycle wheel from 1913, which is a wheel mounted on a wood stool. And of course, as I mentioned in the lecture before, the probably most famous example from Duchamp's ready-made, it's from 1917, and it's the fountain. So the main urinal, which was signed by Marcel Duchamp with a false name, so he called it Wood. It's not Marcel Duchamp, it's Mr. Wood. And it was put into an exhibition. So Duchamp also worked with ready-mades further in his career, so he was also always very interested in this topic, but he specifically chose functional, ordinary, so from daily life, and sometimes really boring objects. And what was the criteria of his choice? So this is according to Marcel Duchamp, and it's a quote from the Art of Assemblage that he discussed the ready-made later in 1961. So this is the quote. Based on a reaction of visual indifference, with at the same time a total absence of good or bad taste. So the idea of Duchamp to do this was to liberate the artist and to liberate the artwork of these bourgeois values of what is good taste or what is bad taste. So, of course, the attitude was very provocative, and it was not by chance that he decided to choose for the fountain a urinal, because normally a fountain, especially a public fountain and so, is something that you know that you are not supposed to urinate on. So the whole idea of using something which originally is made to urinate on and say this is a fountain is absolutely subversive. So of course the whole idea was most of all to shock the habits and the way of thinking of the bourgeoisie at the time, and it was also questioning what can be an artwork, and it's also questioning the authorship and who did the work. Anyone could have done the work. So and also the role of is it so important that I myself as the artist sign the work with my own name, or is what happens if I put the name of someone else, but I still present it as mine. So the whole idea was really to make it's a piece that, besides being an object in itself, it's a piece that makes questions. And this was the Dada attitude. We will talk about Dada today. And we say Dada, the Dada movement appeared before Surrealism, and it was very connected to Cabaret Voltaire. And the whole idea of Dada was already to start subversing. It had a very strong anarchistic intention, so to really question society and to question art and to question all sorts of values. And in many ways, Dada is also anti-artistic. It's anti-art. So it was really meant to completely question everything. And Marcel Duchamp, his especially the beginning of this work, goes very much into this Dada direction. But we will talk a little bit more about Duchamp and the ready-made now. So the theory behind the ready-made was explained in an anonymous editorial published in May 1917 on the Avantgarde magazine The Blind Man, which was run by Duchamp and two friends. So I will read you now a quote, and in this quote Marcel Duchamp is talking about Mr. Moot. Mr. Moot is the name of the person who supposedly would have signed the fountain. Whether Mr. Moot, with his own hands, made the fountain or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an ordinary article of life and placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under the new title and point of view, created a new thought for that object. So in this quote, you see everything which I was trying to explain before, that the whole point of this piece and the whole point of the ready-made was to create a new thought about this object. And there's another important point here that Marcel Duchamp mentions specifically. It doesn't matter if Mr. Muth did the object with his own hands. So it doesn't matter if the artist, Mr. Muth here is just an excuse for the artist. It doesn't matter if the artist actually makes the object. It's not necessary. He can pick up some other object. He can choose it. So in this way, what Marcel Duchamp proposes is that the artist does not have to be the maker. And this is also, of course, subversive because it detaches the artist from the obligation of being the one who does. The artist can be the one who conceives, who has the idea, and who chooses. Because most of all, what was important was to choose the object, to have a point of view, and to create a new thought for that object. So from the moment I decide, okay, this used to be a urinal, but I decide that in this other context, and with these changes I choose to do it, this object becomes a fountain. So by cancelling the only useful function of the object, this object becomes an artwork. Also, that the presentation and addition of a title to this piece creates a new meaning for the object. So for Duchamp, with a ready-made, we reach the conclusion or the point that art is defined by the artist. Choosing the object and what is used and how it's assembled and the context where it goes, it's a creative act. And the function of the object does not make its art form. This is the choice of the artist. And from the moment that I decide to pick up this object, present the concept and put it in a context that I say, or the gallery or so on, and present it, this becomes the artwork. So this was the first time that an artist also creates this idea that the concept is more important. So in many ways, Marcel Duchamp was also, one can say, one of the founders of conceptual art, which would appear later. And you have in your slides some examples from Marcel Duchamp. So you have the bicycle wheel and you also have the fountain. Another technique or another media which was developed was the found object or objet trouvé in French. And sometimes the boundaries between these different techniques are not so stiff. So you could say that in some ways a collage which integrates, like the example I gave before, a collage which integrates the train ticket in some way is also an objet trouvé, because the train ticket is a found object which can be included in the work. So, but in any case, a found object is a natural or a man-made object, a fragment of an object. It can also be, that can be found, but it can also be bought by an artist and preserved because the artist found that this object is interesting for some reason. So found objects can be treated as a work of art in itself. This depends on the idea of the artist, and the whole idea was that for some reason this the artist was interested in this object. Somehow this object triggered some intuition, or was somehow inspiring, or often the artist felt that this object revealed something about her or his interior world, or that it was an important physical representation of his creative process. So, for example, many artists did collections or do collections of found objects, and this can be all sorts of things. They can be natural materials, it can be shells or metaphysical objects or solids, any kind of objects that somehow represent the interior world, or things that the artist is interested in. So another technique is the assemblage, and the assemblage is an art which is made by assembling or putting together different elements, and often these are everyday objects which can have been collected by the artists or bought specially. So assemblage was also something that was started by Pablo Picasso with his cubist constructions, and one can see here also that you could ask the question, but what is the difference between ready-made and assemblage? Well, the difference is that the ready-made often is it picks up objects that are still very formal. So an object which you still recognize as an object full, and the assemblage can also do this, but it can also work with just parts of the object. So often what happens with assemblage is that these parts of objects, they are scavenged. So you know, a scavenger is an animal, and this is part of the concept of the technique of assemblage. Scavenger is an animal that picks up rests of things and in a way recycles them. So the whole idea of assemblage is also to pick up these fragments of things and then put them together in a different context. So you can say that the Frankenstein monster, for example, in a way is a kind of assemblage of rests of other bodies. So this was also a kind of idea that probably was circulating since Romanticism and might have influenced these ideas of assemblage. And I come to this reference because assemblage was used by Picasso, but it was also used in 1918 by the Dada artist Kurt Schwitters, who worked a lot with collage and assemblage, and he really used to scavenge, so to collect these scrap materials, so really parts and rests of things, and call them together. And he called this technique merz, so this kind of mix of things. And I come to this because Dada, as I mentioned before, was the movement that opened the door to Surrealism. And in Surrealism, there came really a technique or an art form which was called the cadavre exquis, or the exquisite corpse. And this picks up this Frankenstein idea. The idea of the cadavre exquis was to work different artists from the Surrealist movement. Each one would contribute with these randomly collected and kind of randomly automatically assembled parts, and then ship them from one to the next, and then the end artwork would be this assemblage of all these disparate parts, and each person, like a little bit in the game, would receive this collection and assemble its own way. And so the whole idea was also to give up control on what would happen in the process, and let it develop. So it was also to create this kind of artistic Frankenstein. So this exquisite corpse. So this is weird, fascinating, monstrous creation. And of course, the idea of corpse, the reference to corpse comes to this idea of death. So assemblage also has a little bit this morbid connotation of picking up rests or parts or fragments of objects which somehow have been destroyed or are destroyed in the process and recycled, reintegrated, and transformed into something else. And this is, of course, also important in the context of the still life, because as you learned, and for example, in the case of Vanitas still life, or that picks up this memento mori tradition, this idea of meditation between life and death is really important. So the whole idea of assemblage can also be traced back to the life cycle of objects, and of course to the life cycle of the human. So you have in your file, for example, on your PDF on page 12, you have an example from the Dada artist Kurt Schwitters, where you see these patched fragments of scraps of different newspapers. There's also part of a train ticket, and it's also interesting when we look at these artworks, although we do not see the shapes as we would say normally before in a still life. We do not see the shapes of the objects, but by looking at these fragments, we somehow can already trace the history. We can start in our mind to try to guess the narrative, what could this come from, and so, and at the same time we are liberated because the narrative is not completely direct. It's not a straightforward propaganda story that only has one meaning. There's allusions to different things, so the viewer has the possibility of, like in a mystery novel or in some kind of game, of creating the story and making these guesses of what these things could be by looking at the name of a place. For example, in this collage here from Kurt Schwitters, we see that there's a train ticket with the name Dresden, and this is already a way to start. And we also see upside down a fragment with the letters S-A-T, so maybe this could be Saturday, but it could also be Saturn, we don't know. So small things that give already some hints, and they might have been chosen on purpose by the artist, or they might have been also put there randomly because the artist on purpose was trying to unlock something from the unconscious. And this, of course, opens, also this universe of mystery that makes looking at one of these collages a bit like a really fun game. So another technique which was used or developed by the Avantgarde was appropriation. So appropriation in art and art history can be defined as an artist using objects that already exist or images that were not transformed very much from the original. So it can also be, say, in German you would say a Zitat, so a reference, a citation to work of art. For example, again, Pablo Picasso, he was one of the masters of appropriation, so often he's also criticized because of this, because he was constantly picking up motives and even directly images from other artists, and exactly as they were, and transforming them and reinterpreting them in his own way. So there's many examples like the Las Meninas from Velázquez, or other, if one goes through the whole Picasso very prolific catalog of work, you could say whenever he was running out of ideas, he would just choose something another artist had done and stealing from everyone to produce his own interpretations. But in fact, this was also in a way very liberating for the artist, because it's also a fact that this is also how knowledge works. We are constantly learning from what we are exposed in the environment, and we always transport a history. So we might have sometimes the, the pride or the vanity to say, oh, I created something very original. This is absolutely new. Nobody's thought about this before. But this is not really the case, because we are always absorbing things, and whatever we produced is constantly influenced by whatever we absorbed before. But of course, every person transforms it in his or her own way, and that's why we can see in this way of appropriation that artists on purpose picked up this idea to really say it transport this message directly. Yes, I picked up this theme from this artist, and I'm directly using the same, and I'm studying and doing what he did, and perhaps doing it and transforming it in my own way. So this is one way that appropriation can be defined. So it raises a lot of questions about originality, authorship, who does the image or the work really belong to, and also if it's authentic or not. So in this way, it's also really subversive, because it raises this question: who did it before? Who was the first person who did this? And is it really done by this person, or is it done by someone else or something else? So later also Andy Warhol, again, who picked up all of these techniques, would incorporate machines, so printing machines, to massively reproduce images which were also appropriated from daily objects and publicity and so on, and constantly reproduce them. And this, of course, this idea was started already in 1934 by the German philosopher Walter Benjamin, who wrote about this idea of the reproduction in his book, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. So this idea of appropriation was also further and further developed. You have as an example. Also, I would like also now to make here a point, because again, the boundaries between ready-made and appropriation, they are, blurry. So it lies more in the artists. When, for example, when you choose to work with with these different objects or part of objects and have an idea and put them together in a specific way, it is important that the artist is able to say, I mean that this is an objet trouvé, or I mean that this is a ready-made, or I mean that this is an appropriation, because it's a different idea. It's different in the sense that when I choose to work with appropriation, it means that I want to say, I have the intention that this creative piece wants to pick up something that was done from someone else or that belongs to a different context and put it together to create this idea or reproduce it. So you have on page 14, but the boundaries are, not very clear, which is also interesting. Because these techniques were developed also sequentially. Of course, it started with a collage and then it developed sequentially. So you have, for example, here in page 14 of the PDF I gave you, you have the Lobster Telephone from Salvador Dali, which is a surrealist piece, but has this idea of appropriating two objects from completely different universes, but at the same time creating a new object. And in this case, it's different from the objet trouvé because the Lobster Telephone still has a function. This is really interesting here, because it's not like the Objet trouvé from Marcel Duchamp. So the bicycle wheel you cannot use as a bicycle wheel, it's something completely different. In this case, the lobster telephone, it's still a telephone. In fact, you could hold it and you could theoretically use it as a telephone because the part which has a telephone is still there. But you would be picking a handle which is also a lobster. So it's all in the way the story is created. So another manifestation of the avant-garde, and this one I'm also specifically fond of, is performance art. And of course I mention here performance art, and you think, but this course is organized with this focus on the still life. So how can we integrate something which is still life, so supposedly objects that do not move, and this is what defines the still life, and how can we integrate something that is performance art, that means that it has live components that are happening in real life with real living bodies. And of course this is a very legitimate question, but the fact is that performance art really picks up this idea exactly because often, you might have noticed or you might have seen, performance art works a lot with movement, of course, but also with time. And often performance art, you can see, works with the idea of being still, of not moving, which for a living human body is an extremely challenging thing to do. So performance art sometimes is also referred to as endurance art, exactly because the artist might create these situations that take the body to extremes and really test the body's physical, mental, and spiritual conditions. But now we talk a little bit about the history of performance art and how it appeared in this context of the avant-garde. So a definition of performance art is very simple. We can say that performance art is concerned with artworks that are created through the actions performed by the artist or other participants, and this can happen live or they can also be documented. It can be an organic, spontaneous process, or it can also have a script. So the terms performance art and performance, they became to be recognized as an art form in itself in the 70s, but the beginning of performance art as a visual art form was with the avant-garde, so around 1910, and we can say that the first performance artists were the Futurists and the Dada, who did performance art in the Dada cabarets. So often performance art, especially in the 20th century, was seen as a non-traditional way of making art. And performance art, by definition, one could say, and that's why it's very connected to Dada, has the idea of really questioning habits, questioning protocols, questioning traditions, and doing this either by recreating them in very specific contexts or by really subverting the meaning of these actions. So the actions in performance art are always really important, exactly also because of the meaning. Of course, performance art, because it's very immaterial, and in the beginning, often it wasn't even documented, has a very strong connection to conceptual art. So we could also say that in the beginning, with the Dada cabarets and also with the Futurists, that these performances were had already a very strong conceptual component. So also the differences between performance art and conceptual art are not so strong, but of course you could say that performance art is one form of conceptual art, so conceptual art is more encompassing, but of course performance art is an art form in itself. So in the beginning, performance art really had more this idea of making questions, questioning reality, questioning possibilities, questioning art and the role of the artist. And then it became, especially in the 70s, we will have this in one of the further lessons, especially in the 70s, performance art became very connected to social and political change, and also became recognized or can be approached as a form of social activism. So you have on page 16, you have an example still from futurist performance art. And futurist performances, in many ways, you could say that they can also be traced with this idea of the still life, because, and you can see from the picture you have as a reference, that the costumes are really abstracting the human from any kind of human form. So the performance basically look and this performance by Fortunato De Pero for the ballet Machine of 3000. So the futurists were very interested, as the name say, with the future. They were interested in the machine, in violence, in speed. They were also interested in fascism. They were also anti-feminist, and they were very, very extreme in many ways. But they were anti-bourgeois. They wanted to completely change society, and they wanted to defend these values of progress and mechanization. And so in many ways they were also not very focused on the human. So the whole idea of these futurist performances was to celebrate the aesthetic of the machine, and the costumes, the performance were instructed by Fortunato De Pero to move in a way the least human possible, to move as a robot, to move as a machine. And the costumes completely emphasized them. And so the whole idea was really to create this kind of futuristic, subversive liberation of and progress and modernity. Another example you have, this is not from the Futurist, this is from Dada. You have it on page 17. It's Hugo Ball in Cabaret Voltaire in Zurich, wearing a costume by Marcel Janko. So you see here also that the body of Hugo Ball appears with this costume a little bit also like some kind of robot. But the Cabaret Voltaire Dada performances were very different from the Futurists, in the sense that Dada was not interested in fascism. In fact, Dada was really anarchistic, so exactly the other extreme opposite. Although they were also really interested in cutting completely with bourgeois values. So the idea of Cabaret Voltaire was really to make things that on purpose looked silly, that were not what was supposed to be done, to say things randomly, and basically to make questions, to question society and break protocols, break all existing protocols. And this was done, Hugo Ball's performance, it was done also using not just movement, and you can see from the costume that he wasn't allowed to move much, so he was basically very still. And this is also the difference between, it clearly shows the difference between a performance as an art form that works with a live audience and a theater piece. Of course, nowadays we see theater that incorporates aspects from performance art, so the lines became more and more blurry, and these universes are more and more mixed. But at the beginning, it wasn't like that at all. So one who would go into Cabaret Voltaire and see these in these evenings, these performances, you would get a completely different show than what you would be expecting to. So you would not see an actor acting and reciting a text. as you normally would. You would see someone in this very weird, absurd costume, barely moving or not moving at all, reading a piece of text that probably didn't make sense from the beginning to the end, or saying all sorts of subversive things that one was probably not supposed to say. So this was the Dada attitude. On page 18, you have another example of performance by the Futurists, and this is The Art of Noise by Luigi and Hugo Piatti. So now we make here a little bit of stop after we learned about all of these techniques. And now I will just go through each one of these avant-garde movements, and I will also give you some dates. So about these movements, and give some examples of artists which worked. And in your slides, you get also some examples of how each one of these movements worked with the topic of the still life. So, and I hope that you can also take it as a reference for your Avantgarde. So the Futurism was a movement that started around 1909 and developed until 1914. And as I mentioned before, it was the most important Italian avant-garde movement of the 20th century. And it developed, of course, because of the influence of French Cubism and this passion for the idea of speed and progress. So Futurism really celebrated technology, urban life, and wanted to destroy all older forms of culture and celebrate the machine, speed, violence, and change. So in terms of media, of course, the Futurists worked with performance, as I mentioned, but Futurist artists mostly worked also with traditional media, such as painting and sculpture. And some of the most examples, I mean, one of the most important figure of the Futurist movement was Marinetti, who wrote the manifesto of the Futurist movement. Also an important thing, it's not mentioned in your slides, but I mention it here, was that each one of these avant-garde movements wrote manifestos. So the idea of the manifesto was really that these groups of artists had often ideological agenda, so they had very specific ideas, often political, and these movements really collected these ideas through these manifestos, which had the intention of spreading the ideology and also to make people read them and change society. So you have some examples on page 20, 21, and of Futurist still lives, and you can see how the aesthetic is very close to Cubism, although this idea of speed, and also you see that, for example, in Cubism you would see that the colors which were used were a lot of grays and browns, and in Futurist paintings you see a lot of very strong clashes of colors. You have a lot of black, and you also have dark reds and dark blues, so very saturated clashing colors. So often this idea of speed and also of violence comes through the compositions. And so Marinetti, of course, was theoretically in terms of the theory and of the movement, very important figure, but some of the most notorious artists were Umberto Boccioni, Giacomo Balla, and Gino Severini. Another movement, Suprematism, so Suprematismus, started around 1913, and it's difficult to say exactly when it ended, because Suprematism was a movement which was led by This is the Russian avant-garde, and the movement was led by Kazimir Malevich. Of course, there were other artists that really developed suprematism, for example, Lisitsky and Alexander Rodchenko. Each one of them with specific ways, of course, specific languages to develop suprematism. But the general idea of the suprematists was to reduce art to its essentials. So they wanted to create a radically abstract art which was done only by using simple, pure geometric forms. And this was generally developed through painting. And so the whole idea was to take painting and use and explore what are the most essential aspects that we can use to develop this medium. So painting as a medium. It was in this way a very rational movement, although this interest in abstraction, of course, also had sometimes metaphysical, mystical, or even spiritual interest. So the whole idea of suprematism was also to say, in how far can we go and reduce what appears in the painting and reduce what appears in the medium, and that we can still call this art. And of course, the maximum reduction was, you have some examples here. So you have from Malevich, dynamic suprematism, where you see, and this you can see almost as a still life, which is done not with objects of everyday life, but just the simple geometric forms. So the square, the rectangle, the circle, and the triangle. And in dynamic suprematism from 1915, you still see a lot of geometric shapes, and they are interacting. So the composition makes this kind of work between balance and instability, and so playing with all the way these different shapes can be arranged together. And also, of course, color, in how far, and we see in suprematism that not just shape, but color is also massively reduced, or more and more in this process of reduction. And then you see it on page 24 that we have two other examples from Malevich, so black square and red square, so already very reduced. And then the final reduction in 1924, the black square, so the ultimate reduction. And now we get to Dada. So finally, we already talked about Dada, but it's good for you to have a sequence so you can see, but you can see that some of these dates also overlap. There was a little bit of Dada while there was Futurism. There was still a little bit of suprematism while when Dada appeared. So often these avant-garde movements really influenced each other. But Dada started around 1915 and went until 1924. And it was an artistic and literary movement that appeared in Zurich as a reaction to the First World War. And although it started in Zurich, it spread and it inspired similar groups in New York, Paris, Berlin, Cologne, and Hanover. And it opened the door to Surrealism. So Dada was the first conceptual art movement and really opened up art, the art field as performance, art as life, and art also, most importantly, as the result of participation of the audience. So art, not just the art in itself, but taking in consideration the reaction of the audience, or even that the audience can be involved in the performance itself. So nowadays we call this participatory art, And we can say, for example, this is a performance which has a participatory component. It means it is part of the art and the intention of the artwork that the audience is integrated in the work. But this was also started with Dada. So the focus of Dada was to make difficult questions about society and trying out new approaches like the ready-made, and also questioning what is art, what is society, what is artistic creativity, questioning everything. And you have on page 26 an example from Kurt Schwitters from 1920 of is it a collage, is it an assemblage? You can decide. And also again Marcel Duchamp and the ready-made. And another ready-made by Marcel Duchamp, this one just one object, the porte-bouteille. And of course the fountain. Another movement of the avant-garde, which would have specifically very strong importance and influence in Bauhaus, was the Stil. And this started in 1917 and developed until 1931. So the Stil was a Dutch movement that also appeared as a reaction to World War I. And the idea of the Stil was that art had a social and spiritual importance and should be used to redeem society. So the whole idea of the Stil was to create this kind of spiritual language of art that had the possibility of creating a new world. So it also had the intention of reacting against the Art Deco, which happened before. So it was also an idea of art, which was not just in terms of expression, but an art which also had a direct connection with objects of daily life. So not only the artists and many of the artists who were working with the Stil, or who started the Stil, most importantly was Piet Mondrian and Theo van Doesburg, and also, for example, Vilmos Hutzka. And these artists, they wanted that these artistic principles could also be applied to objects of daily life. So, for example, and this went to design objects and also to interior and to architecture. So the whole idea was to stop this over-decoration of Art Deco, eliminating this kind of representation and proposing an abstract aesthetic which worked with a visual language of pure geometric forms and only primary colors. So Piet Mondrian was influenced because of this idea. The avant-garde, many avant-garde movements were also, this is important to say, were also influenced by political ideas, because after the First World War, there was a lot of the young, new intelligentsia, so the people who wanted to change the world, to change society, they were connected to different ideologies and to different ideas, new ideas of creating a new world. So often this was anarchistic, like in the case of Dada, or fascist, like in the case of Futurist. In the case of the Stil, they were interested in Theosophy, which was a spiritual belief system which was influenced by Eastern mysticism. So it was not political, it was more spiritual, one could say, but it also had this idea of social reform, so of changing society by a specific system of values. And the idea of the Stil was to create an art form and to create an aesthetic, that's the definition actually I was looking for, to create an aesthetic that could be used to change society through the contact of this aesthetic. So in the case of Piet Mondrian. He was influenced by these mystic ideas of Theosophy, and Theo van Doesburg, who started the Journal of the Stil. He was very interested in this fusion of form and function as an ultimate style that would encompass all different kinds of arts: painting, sculpture, industrial design, architecture, typography. So all ranges of where aesthetic was present. And of course, this would have a very strong influence, as I mentioned before, in the Bauhaus and in the development of the international style. You have some examples for example, from Theo van Doesburg. This on page 31. This is a still life, although he's still not working with the primary colors here yet. It's from 1916, and I chose this image here also to show you that there are also some elements, you could say, still of cubism and so, but you could also say that there's also some the use of color in this case might remind a little bit of Futurism, but you see that the stability of the composition does not give this idea of movement and speed. It's actually a very stable, meditative composition, and of course this was much more the idea of the Stil. I did not add in the slides, I'm sorry, I forgot to add in the slides some images, but please Google Piet Mondrian. Piet Mondrian, this should really be here, but please Google Piet Mondrian and check his paintings of trees, because this was one of the exercises that he really started. He was painting these trees in this kind of, still, one could say, a little bit influenced by Cubism style, also in terms of colors. Before he was working with primary colors, and then he picked up this abstraction he did of trees to develop more and more his grids, his orthogonal grids, and his system of geometric composition. Piet Mondrian was also very, very interested in jazz, and so he worked with the rhythms of jazz and incorporated it in his rhythmic compositions in painting. So please take a look. And now we are arriving at another movement, so Constructivism. Constructivism started in 1915 and developed until approximately 1940. And it was also in Russia, and it evolved after the October Revolution of 1917 as a movement itself. But actually, constructivist ideas were already starting in 1915. So constructivists borrowed ideas from Cubism, Suprematism, and Futurism, and the whole idea was to pick up these ideas to make a new approach to making objects, where one could replace traditional aesthetic concerns of composition with an idea of construction, so hence the idea of constructivism. So it stressed the idea of the inherent physical characteristics of the material, so working with the properties of the materials itself, liberating them from any kind of symbolic associations. So in this way, it also, like the Futurist, tries to express the dynamism of the modern world and of the rapidly changing Russian society. But the constructivists wanted to apply, of course it was very connected to communism, and so it was in many ways, constructivism, very functional. So it was liberated from symbolic associations, and constructivism was also often used for the constructivist principles for Russian propaganda. The difference also between constructivism and suprematism was that suprematism was very concerned with painting, and constructivists were very interested in a way like the Stil. It also had this very strong idea of social reform and how you can apply these constructivist principles to construct a new society. And one of the manifestations of this was also the theater. So these constructivist pieces normally had a text which had the idea of changing the mind, changing the mentality of the audience by using also these set designs which were assembled together with constructivist elements. And this was a reference also, in a way, like Futurism. Constructivism was also very interested in the machine, and it was also very interested in mass production. So the idea was to see society as a system, and a system that can be, or a machine, and a system that can be made agile, and this of course including the human, towards political and social goals. So three of the most important or distinguished artists from the constructivist movement were Vladimir Tatlin, Alexander Rodchenko, and El Lissitzky. And here you have some examples. We have this example, very famous example from Vladimir Tatlin, the Monument to the Third International, which is a very large-scale monument of a. This is also called often the Tatlin Tower. And I chose this image for you because it's a hybrid, you could say, but this is a sculpture, it's an architecture model, but it also has some still life quality. Another image I chose here for you, also from El Lissitzky, it's a sentry, and this is a three-dimensional design of the electromechanical show Victory Over the Sun. So it's an idea for a costume design. And now we arrive at Bauhaus. So Bauhaus, we will not talk about the different phases of Bauhaus, so this is also just an overview. So the Bauhaus was founded in 1919, and it lasted until 1933, and it was an art school in Weimar, Germany, the first one, founded by Walter Gropius, and promoted this comprehensive and multidisciplinary approach to the arts, encouraging students to practice visual arts, craft and design, performance art, industrial design, typography. So this idea of bringing together expressive arts, applied arts, and design, but also with a very strong connection to industry, and also with this idea of social reform. So it picked up ideas on arts and crafts, so to put together fine and applied arts. Actually, we covered the avant-garde, I just realized, because when we did, I also wanted to say, when we did design history last winter, we went very systematically through the avant-garde, and that's also one of the reasons why we don't go now through all of the history of Bauhaus. We are more focused on the art movements here. But in any case, just to remember that the movement put... so the idea was to unite fine and applied arts, creativity and manufacturing, art and industrial design. And the movement put equal importance on form and function, and wanted to reduce decoration, to rejuvenate design, to apply it for the objects of everyday life. So the Bauhaus style was, of course, there were many different approaches at the Bauhaus also. As I mentioned, it was founded by Walter Gropius, but of course the different masters of the Bauhaus had a different influence in the way they approached the courses, so that there were different methodologies. There was, of course, Josef Albers, Marcel Breuer, Paul Klee, Vasily Kandinsky. but also, of course, Oskar Schlemmer and Johannes Itten. And why? And here, in the context of the still life, I think it's important to mention that when you go, for example, through many of the Bauhaus archives, and you can really see that the way, for example, the design objects, they are designed and so, but the way they are documented through photography, you can see that each of these documentations also is a still life. So this whole idea that even the document of Gesamtkunstwerks or a total artwork, and this idea that even the documentation of the objects produced there, or the photographies and so, that they are also art forms in themselves. So many beautiful, interesting still lifes were produced at the Bauhaus. I chose here for you some which have a stronger level of abstraction or more metaphysical, and some which are a little bit more more direct in reference to still life, but you can see how these Bauhaus objects are displayed, and we can see the properties of the design, but we can also see the way the light is treated in the picture and so on. So on page 36 you have this example by Walter Peterhans, Die Tote Hase, and another one also by Walter Peterhans, Ophelia. And by Lucia Maholi, so this is the design of the tea service by Marianne Brandt, documented and displayed as a still life, very classical in this way of still life representation. A still life by Joost Schmidt. This is on page 40 an exercise by students of Johannes Itten on the 4 course, so the beginner's course. And you can see that this work by Johannes Itten is also in many ways an assemblage. The same on page 41, also an assemblage. And these exercises of Itten, they were made for the students to develop their feeling for haptics, so the touch, feeling for touch for the material, the properties of the material, what can I do with the different textures, how can this be translated into form, how can I assemble it together, and also, of course, by working directly with hand and not just in drawing, and seeing and trying out by experimenting balance and weight, and so all these different components. Another example on page 42 by Johannes Itten for course, and the next one also more abstract. Another of the masters of the Bauhaus who I chose here to show you, and this is because of the connection with performance art. The aesthetic of the Bauhaus was also, of course, very connected to this idea of experience, so directly experiencing through the body and the senses the contact with the material, exploring perception. So the human body was really, as an instrument, consciously developed by the Bauhaus pedagogy. So the whole idea was that by directly developing the human body and the artist's capacity for perception and sensitivity, that the student would become better designers. And this was, of course, not just through theory, but really applying or working with exercises that directly applied these ideas. So the practical aspect and the doing was the most important part at the Bauhaus. And in the case of the pedagogy of Oskar Schlemmer, this was also applied in performance art. So you have on page 44 an example of a performer exploring space, so working with the properties of space by using body extensions. Another different exercise, but working with the same principle of body extensions on page 45. And on page 46, this is one example of the metaphysical ballet. On page 47, we have here a party on the rooftop of the Bauhaus with some of Oskar Schlemmer's students while wearing the costumes for the Triadisches Ballet, which were made with simple geometric shapes. So you can see here some references, of course, to the Stil, as I mentioned before, also a little bit constructivist, but applied to the theater. And on page 48 you have the costumes of the Triadisches Ballet, which now you can again go and pay a visit at Staatsgalerie, and you can see the way they are there. Of course, these costumes were made to be used in movement, but as you probably saw, you can see online recreations of on YouTube of Triadisches Ballet. You can see that the performance couldn't really move very fast, so these objects, these costumes were designed in a way that really made the performer move very, very mindfully and also very, very slowly and in specific ways. So in a way, while performing in these objects, in these costumes, the performer could really, while in movement, reflect on the geometry and on how this geometry directly influences the human body in movement. And on page 49 you have an example from a still life from another of Paul Klee's, from another of Bauhaus masters, and this is Paul Klee. So this one is called Colorful Meal, and there's all the elements of a still life, but although they are not appearing represented on a flat surface of a table, they are all vertical. So this is also really completely new for a still life. But all the elements of still life are there. There's a wine bottle, a glass bottle, a fork, there's a plate with food, there's a little house and a flag, and there's also a cat. And other more abstract elements. So, colorful meal. This is a still life. Another still life by Paul Klee you have on page 50. And this one is called Still Life, so in this sense it's more direct, more traditional, but there's also no representation of a flat table, so again the table disappears and it's all appearing in the same vertical surface, as if the objects would be suspended on air. So, and this one also has a little bit metaphysical or spiritual references, but we see that all these traditional still life components are there. So we have a pitcher, we have glasses, we also have a cone or maybe a pyramid, but I don't think no, it's definitely a cone, and a lemon. And it's a still life with jars, fruit, Easter egg, and curtains. And we are almost arriving at the end of our class. This one was a little bit longer. So we arrive finally at Surrealism. So Surrealism started officially around 1924 and it developed until 1966, but one could also say that Surrealism didn't completely disappear. We make this stop here more because Surrealism was actually continued in the 60s with pop art, one could say. Although the attitude is a little bit different, but what started with Dada and then was more in this form of Surrealism started in 1926 and ended around 1966. So Surrealism arrives in Paris with the influence of Dada, and the idea of the Surrealist, or the hope, was to access powerful ideas by going beyond conscious thought. So Surrealism was also interested in rejecting this bourgeois values, so also strongly anarchistic, and wanted to make a revolution of thinking, so completely changing the minds. It was very influenced by the theories on the unconscious by Sigmund Freud, so the founder of psychoanalysis. And so it explored the topics of dreams, desire, and also repression. So André Breton, who was a writer, surrealist poet, made the Surrealist Manifesto, and he proposed that artists would completely reject reason and logic and choose to access the unconscious and develop their art by automatism, so automatic systems such as automatic writing, and on purpose giving up control and any pre-definitions and plans. So using this kind of automatic ways of creating art, of creativity, and also exploring dreams, paying attention to the dreams, to the images of the dreams, remembering them, and incorporating them in the art. So, of course, this meant that each artist would directly access and channel her or his own interior world and work with these images and ideas of the interior world to make the art. And we can see, for example, in the work of different artists, such as Salvador Dali or Max Ernst, also Juan Miró, that there were personal recurrent motives. So images or symbols or topics that each one of them was specifically interested in. So Dali, for example, had as recurrent motives the egg, the rhinoceros, or the ants. These appeared frequently. And also Max Ernst, for example, had an alter ego which was a bird. So these strategies were used often. Also Frida Kahlo, for example, who was a very successful female Mexican artist, surrealist artist. She directly worked by depicting her own very personal interior world. Frida Kahlo also, she had very difficult health conditions. She had an accident when she was young, so she lived with chronic pain, had a lot of operations, and often she had to paint when she was in bed. And so painting for her was important, not just as a form of catharsis, but also as a way of creating her own world. She created her own world through painting, and also in the case of Frida Kahlo, very importantly, she did not separate her artistic persona, so her presentation as an artist, from her artwork. So her own artistic persona was also part of her art. So how she presented herself, how she prepared her hair, styled her outfits, and so and this persona was integrated as she represented herself also in the paintings, and this was also something new. So also surrealist works, because of this anarchistic component, were also provocative. They wanted also to change the way we see objects and the way we think about the world. So they caused a lot of shock often, and also sensations, also because surrealists were very interested in these topics of desire, sexuality, madness, and also repression. So all these things that, as Sigmund Freud said, normally are repressed can be repressed in the unconscious. Surrealists wanted to open this door of the unconscious and really bring these things up and show these images, because often these images that were treated by the surrealists were not just from the individual interior world of the artist, but also from our collective unconscious. So the idea was also to bring these things from the human, from the mind, which are recurrent motives that appear, and by bringing them and putting them in the art, again confronting the audience with these fears, repressed desires, things that make people uncomfortable or uneasy. So Surrealists really wanted to pick up myths also, the idea of primitivism, so the primitive cultures, and basically also to disturb bourgeois comfortable ideas of what is reality. So just to give you also a little bit an idea, André Breton, who I mentioned before, was leader of this new group of poets in Paris. He wrote in 1924 in his Surrealist Manifesto, so for a definition of Surrealism, that Surrealism is pure psychic automatism by which one proposes to express, either verbally, in writing, or by any other manner, the real functioning of thought. Dictation of thought in the absence of all control exercised by reason, outside of all aesthetic or moral preoccupation. So in this way it was really with this idea of liberation. And you have some examples here on page 53, Man Ray. So you have an iron with nails attached, and it's called The Gift. So you can connect also with this Dada attitude of the ready-made, and also an object which used to have a function, and an iron becomes a gift, but it's a kind of poisonous gift because it has nails. So I'm not sure if Man Ray was thinking about feminism, but as a woman, at least when I look at this piece, I have very, very strong feelings about it, that maybe there is some feminist undertone. I have to inform myself about it if it is or not, but I invite you to take a look, especially since most of the audience of my students are women. Another example on page 54 is a mannequin with cone and spheres by Man Ray. So the mannequin in this very playful, arranged in a playful manner, and this is of course also a still life. And from 1925-26, self-portrait of Man Ray with a selection of surrealist objects. On page 56, we have a painting by Frida Kahlo. Many of the paintings of Frida Kahlo really make the viewer uncomfortable, because she very bravely was not afraid of showing death and of showing blood and of showing pain in her work. She lived, as I mentioned before, with chronic pain, and she didn't hide it. This was assumed in her artwork, and it was also transformed into a sublime depiction. But of course, as you see here in this painting, Tuna, still life with prickly pears, our immediate perception is this is a still life with pears, and the pears look kind of rotten and they are bloody, and there's blood on the tablecloth. So this is also a very subversive still life. But at the same time, we can definitely see it as a vanitas. Another subversive painting by Frida Kahlo, which instead of being call it because the French name for still life is nature morte, so dead nature, paradoxically. And so Frida Kahlo here makes a subversion of the nature morte by calling naturaleza viva, living nature, alive nature. Another painting by Frida Kahlo, The Bride Frightened at Seeing Life Opened. And now we have some examples from René Magritte from Belgium, who also developed surrealism in a very specific, recognizable style. And here I hope, for example, this painting from page 59 gives you some ideas for the Aufgabe task we have for this week, of how to use the interior, integrate the interior in this still life manner. So we have still a recognizable interior, but René Magritte really worked with these paradoxical situations, so not only changing the scale of the objects, but also having walls that look like the sky, and mirrors that don't really mirror. So all these things that make us that create dissonance in the way we perceive the work. Also another example on page 60, l'explication. This is what could be seen as a traditional still life with a table, and then we have a bottle and we have a carrot, and then we have a hybrid between the bottle and the candle and the carrot, I'm sorry. So we can already start making a story. How do these two objects fuse? So one is the mother and one is the father, and one is the child. What happened here? But also at the same time, this third object looks a little bit like a bullet. It could be a bullet. We don't know. And then, of course, we have these mountains and this kind of dream landscape in the back. Another example of a still life on page 61 by René Magritte, which is called A Portrait. So it's presented as still life, but the title says this is not a still life, it's a portrait. And we have very classical, apparently classical still life components of representation, but then strangely there's an eye in the middle of the ham, in the middle of the plate. So our idea of the still life is already immediately disturbed. And it's also an interesting idea to imagine I would be looking at this food, but actually this food could be looking at me. And then at the end we have a collection of Magritian paradoxes, which is called the interpretation of dreams. And we have an egg, which is called l'acacia, and we have a shoe, which is called la lune. So the shoe is called the moon. We have a hat, which is called la neige, the snow. We have a hammer, which is called the desert. So all these paradoxical situations presented in this very interesting way that reminds how probably in the beginning of the 20th century, but still nowadays, when children are learning how to read and to write, that we have these archetypal images of what things are and their name, and in this case they are not matching. But this also opens up the discussion on what language is and why do we call objects a certain name and not another name, and why, if one could do it in the surrealist way, if I decide that I call this object skeleton, it can become skeleton to me if I want, but then it might become a communication problem. So, and this is where we end today. We had a long, comprehensive lesson. The next lesson will be a little bit shorter because we will have a little bit development about the next art movements. I can already tell you that we will cover social realism, abstract expressionism, color and color-filled painting, but we are not going to develop them extensively because I will just mention a little bit what they were, but I will not cover them extensively because these genres didn't really develop much work in the still life context, so they are not so much in connection to what you are doing with the Aufgabe, but in any case we will quickly go through them. And then we will talk a lot about Neo-Dada. And so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, that it opened some perspectives, and I think you got a very comprehensive also explanation about these different artistic techniques, which of course do not belong exclusively to the avant-garde. They are still recurrent today, so I hope that you could find interested in them and learn from them, and I hope that you will integrate them in your Aufgabe also. And I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye bye.